a number of different links as to where you can purchase the book, including local booksellers as well. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Zachary Schrag.
Great. Well, thank you. I'm so honored to be here speaking at this event sponsored by the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. And I only wish that I could be there in person, along with the Library of Congress, the American Antiquarian Society, and the Library Company of Philadelphia. The Historical Society of Pennsylvania was one of my main research sites for this book and the scene of many, many happy days of research. So I particularly want to thank David Hogard, Sarah Heim, and Steve Smith for all of their help during my many visits to the HSP while I was writing the book, and to Christopher Damiani for arranging this evening's program. This is a wonderful institution. I'm very glad to be associated with it as a researcher and a friend of HSP. So let me start the screen share here. And you should be seeing the cover of the book. So yeah, this is the book. Again, wherever fine books are sold, you can find it at local retailers. And this is where a lot of it was done. The glorious manuscript room of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. This particular shot was taken in July of 2017 when the Society opened its doors to people attending the conference of the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic. And a bunch of us played hooky, left the conference and came over to do research. That's me in the lower left-hand corner in the tan jacket and the bald spot, using my digital camera to take pictures of some of those 21 million manuscripts that Christopher mentioned. And because I know the date that the photograph was taken, I can even tell you exactly what I was working on. I was working on the diary of Sidney George Fisher, probably the greatest Philadelphia diarist of the 19th century. Some of his works have been published, but not every word of the diary made it into print. So it's great to be able to go back to the original manuscript sources and see all of what Fisher had to say. And this is his entry from May of 1844, reporting on the beginnings of the riots. In addition to magnificent manuscript sources, the HSP maintains all kinds of printed sources, many of which cannot be found anywhere else in the world. So in Philadelphia, you had at that time something like 18 daily newspapers, not all of which survive, but many do, as well as weekly and biweekly and monthly periodicals. And many of these were quite specialized. So in addition to having a newspaper that claimed to be neutral and tell you everything you needed to know, there were more particular newspapers for political parties, for religious denominations. This particular one, the Home Journal and Citizen Soldier, was written by and for members of the militia who were very important to my story. So it's a fantastic way for me to get different perspectives on the event and tell the story from multiple points of view. Some of these sources have been digitized, a great many have not, and that's what makes it so wonderful to come to the HSP and handle the original documents from the 1840s. And it's these sources that really kept me going through the years of research it took to write this book. It's so exciting to me to hear the voices of Philadelphians, in many cases verbatim dialogue, as people wrote down what they said or what they heard someone else say, or people's eyewitness accounts of, again, what they did or someone else did. And so I kept hearing these people from Philadelphia in 1844 telling me their stories, and all I had to do or got to do was to write those stories down and try to put them in a reasonable order in a compelling way. So let's talk about what those people experienced in the world they lived in. And let's start by thinking about the country in the early 1840s. So America in the 1840s was unsettled in many ways. If you think about the revolutionary generation, many of those founding fathers lived into the 1820s, even the 1830s. So if you're living in the 1830s, you can still ask James Madison, oh, what do you intend us to do with this Constitution of yours? Madison dies in 1836. He's the last of the major founders. And so, yes, there are still members of, veterans of the Revolutionary War, but that generation of founders has passed. And it's really up to the new Americans, the young Americans, to figure out the future of their country. As you can see from this map, the borders of the country are not what we know them to be today. They were uncertain. No one's really sure where United States ends and British territory begins in the north. There are the Russians to the northwest. To the southwest, there's this new Republic of Texas. It's been founded by people who left the United States and maybe want to be a state, but maybe not. The Texas debate is raging in the 1840s. And then to the southeast, you've got a quagmire of a war in Florida against the Seminoles that doesn't really end until 1842 or so. So no one's really sure where the boundaries of the nation are. The nation started out with 13 states. That has now doubled to 26 states. So you've got as many new states as old ones. That's a little unsettling. There are all kinds of new inventions, some of them imported from Europe, like the railroad, some of them homegrown, like the steamboat. Among the most powerful and unsettling of the new inventions is the political party. Really not in the Constitution. There were, the first party system kind of fizzled out. In the 1820s, people thought maybe we don't need political parties. But in the late 1820s, what we now know as the Democratic Party emerges and a rival Whig party coalesces in the 1830s. And Americans aren't really sure what these parties will do, whether they want them to last, whether it's okay to be friends with people from another party, or whether you should have knife fights with them. That whole thing is uncertain. People don't know if maybe they should start even more political parties, and that becomes an important part of the story. The potential was still there for a lot more political uncertainty. And then a key question that I try to get at in this book that I think was animating a lot of people was the question of who could be an American. So, of course, with the Declaration of Independence, we have the claim that all men are created equal, but not a lot of people really believe that. Certainly, this is the period where European Americans, their descendants, are taking the land of native peoples from east of the Mississippi and forcing those people to move west. This is the period where slavery is solidifying in the South. And even in states that are gradually abolishing slavery, the rights of free African Americans are being restricted. So the Pennsylvania Constitution of 1838, for example, denies free African Americans the vote. And it's not just racial minorities. In Missouri and then Illinois, you have Mormons who are first embraced and then expelled, events that come to a climax in 1844 as well. And then of particular importance to Philadelphia is the question of new immigrants, especially the Irish. As people understood to be white, the Irish are eligible for naturalization under the Naturalization Act of the 1790s, but not everyone agrees that that's a good idea. And so a big part of my story is what happens to these people who are different, ethnically different in religious faith. Will they be allowed to be full participants in American life? Or will they be subject to what Tocqueville will call the tyranny of the majority and have their rights restricted? Nowhere is this set of debates more pressing than in Philadelphia. Now, Philadelphia at this point is not the city that you know it today, over 100 square miles. That's still Philadelphia County in the 1840s, and that is divided among several jurisdictions. In the center, you have the original city of Philadelphia, around 2 square miles, as laid out by William Penn's famous grid of 1682. His idea was Philadelphia was supposed to stretch from the Delaware to the Schuylkill. Instead, a lot of the growth, instead of going west, goes north and south along the Delaware. And some of these other jurisdictions within Philadelphia County, Spring Garden and Kensington and Northern Liberty and Southwark, are actually among the 15 largest cities in the United States in the 1840 census. So it's not really one city, it's a conglomeration of cities within Philadelphia County. And so Philadelphia County is divided geographically. It's also divided among different communities. And there are lots of different ways that we could think about Philadelphia in terms of class, in terms of race, in terms of gender. I'm looking at three different groups that become, involved in the riots of 1844. First are the Irish immigrants, and it's remarkably hard to get pictures of Irish immigrants from this period, but here we have the homes of two very prominent brothers, Hugh and Patrick Clark. Their houses will be eventually ransacked. We're talking about the 1830s, early 1840s here, so we're not yet to the great mass migration of the potato famine. That starts after the bad harvest of 1845. But even before the Great Famine, Ireland was not thriving economically. The population of the island had grown much faster than the economy. And the reason the potato famine eventually becomes so bad is that people were more and more dependent on potatoes because they lacked other food sources. So starting in the 1830s, hundreds of thousands of people leave Ireland. Some take the new steamships over to England and settle in Liverpool and other areas in England, but many others cross the Atlantic. Some stay within the British Empire, go to Montreal. Others come to the United States and especially end up in the eastern seaports, Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. By 1844, all these numbers are estimates because the census wasn't that careful, but perhaps 35,000 Philadelphians had been born in Ireland and constituted maybe 1 out of 7 residents. And then more still had been born in the United States to Irish parents. Again, many of these immigrants were poor, having fled a somewhat poverty-stricken island. And some of the states were thinking, do we really want these immigrants who might be either dependent on public welfare or who will take jobs at low wages and depress wages for American workers? Many of them are Catholic. There had been Irish immigration to Pennsylvania for centuries, but a lot of that had been Protestant Irish. They had their own issues with acceptance, but starting after 1815, increasing numbers of Irish immigrants are Catholic at a time when America is predominantly Protestant. And the Constitution had forbid the federal establishment of religion, but individual states could still require or limit the rights of Catholics. New Hampshire does into the 1870s. So no one was too sure exactly where Catholicism would fit in public life. But again, the Irish are legally white, which means that after 5 years in the United States, they can become citizens and they can vote. And that means they can compete in elections, both to hold public office, and also as voters, they can expect some of the rewards, some of the public government jobs that usually come with winning an election. So a lot of native-born Americans are seeing them as political competitors as well as economic competitors. The leader of this community is Bishop Francis Patrick Kenrick, himself an Irish immigrant. He goes first to Kentucky and then is appointed essentially assistant and then full bishop of Philadelphia. He arrives in 1830, and he is a very gentle man. He's not as aggressive as some of the other Irish clergy of the day, but he is also determined to help his flock practice Catholicism. So he builds churches. When he arrives, there were only 4 in central Philadelphia. He builds churches around the county and in Kensington and Southwark and other parts of Philadelphia County. And he voices his concern that the public schools are being used to denigrate Catholicism and trying to convert Catholic children to Protestantism. Some of the public schools are mandating the singing of psalms or hymns in Protestant versions. Others, all of the schools are using the King James Bible as a text and asking Catholic children to read from the Bible. Kenrick doesn't like that. He wants them to use Catholic versions of the Bible, and that becomes a point of dispute in Philadelphia, as it had been in New York and Ireland before that. So that's the Irish community. It's new, it's growing, and more religiously assertive under Kenrick's leadership. Then you have a second community, and that's the Nativists. Unfortunately, it's a word that's hard to say, bit of a tongue twister, but these are people who are born in the United States and believe that having been born on American soil, they are better citizens than any immigrant. And technically, or what they claim is that they're not anti-Catholic. it's pretty hard to believe, because it's very hard to get through a nativist pamphlet or newspaper without some kind of slur against the Catholic Church. I don't know why most of them just didn't admit that. A few of them do say, a few of them say, yes, let's just ban Catholic immigration. Most of them say, no, we don't want to ban immigration, but any immigrant who arrives shouldn't get to be a citizen in 5 years. They should have to wait 21 years to become a citizen and vote and hold office, or maybe they shouldn't ever hold office, just like an immigrant can't become president, maybe an immigrant shouldn't become mayor or any other office. And some of these nativists are Democrats, some of them are Whigs, and they begin to coalesce into their own political movement. Just happened that we talked about early photography, Chris mentioned that. One of these nativists is Augustus Peel, a member of the famous Philadelphia family. He's a grandson of Charles Wilson Peel, and they are among the pioneering photographers of the United States. So we don't have a lot of family snapshots in the 1830s and 40s, but we happen to have one of Augustus Peel, who becomes a character in the story. The leading nativist is this fellow, Levin, who's a fascinating and bizarre human being. He is widely recognized as one of the greatest orators of his generation. He's compared to a great Shakespearean actor. He's compared to Daniel Webster. All of these great 19th century orators, he is in their league. But he's also a very unstable person. In 1841, 1842, he is both bankrupt. He goes bankrupt. He admits later that, yeah, he had spent a lot of his money and time in taverns. He himself was born in the United States. His parents are actually Jewish immigrants to South Carolina, but he's born in South Carolina and claims that native identity and becomes a moral crusader, in part using his position as editor of one of these newspapers, the Daily Sun. And again, I have to thank HSP for preserving key issues of the Daily Sun that are only found there as best I can tell. So, okay, you've got this clash brewing, the Catholic Irish on one side, the anti-immigrant nativists on the other. Who is going to keep the peace? And the answer turns out to be the volunteer militia. Now, these days, militia is a confusing term. If you say militia, some people are going to think, oh, those are those weird guys who dress in camouflage and wave guns around and seem ready to overthrow the government. And other people say, no, the militia, that's the National Guard, right? Those are the people who are in real uniforms and actually obey orders. And militia can have both meanings today. That's also true somewhat in the 1840s. There are at least two meanings of militia. One is sort of every free white man ages 18 to 45 is theoretically a member of the militia. And the idea is that if the British come back, as they did in 1814, all these men will show up and they'll all have been trained and they can fight off the invader, and that prevents America from needing a standing army. In practice, by the 1820s, this system is just ridiculous. Men hate, it's like worse than jury duty. They have to drill once, twice, 3 times a year, lose a day's wages, get yelled at by these officers. They start mocking it. They show up, and instead of carrying a musket, they'll carry a broomstick or a cornstalk or something. The only people it really serves well are people who are elected for a 1-year term as major or colonel and get to use the term major or colonel for the rest of their lives. It's not working well. But then these people on screen, they're a member of a small elite called the volunteer militia. And these are men who really take it seriously. They like military training. They dress in very nice uniforms. They meet once a week to drill. They do target practice. They care about their stuff. What they are there for, I mean, they like dressing up. They like having fancy balls. But what they really believe is that, again, the British or maybe the French or the Spanish or someone could show up anytime, and America will need these troops for defense. That's what they're there for, to fight a foreign enemy. They are not signing up for the most part to put down riots, but starting in the 1830s, that is increasingly what they are called out to do. There are a lot of riots against abolitionists. There are attacks on African American communities. There are violent strikes, and then there are religious riots. And more cities all around the country, especially in the East Coast, are calling out the volunteer militia to try to restore order. Now, the leader of Philadelphia's militia was the member of one of the most prominent families, the Cadwallader family, one of the founding families of Pennsylvania. And George Cadwallader's grandfather had been a militia general in the Revolutionary War. His father had been a militia commander in the War of 1812. George Cadwalader becomes the third Brigadier General Cadwalader to serve Pennsylvania. And again, his belief is that he's really there to fight foreign troops, but if he has to, he will do his duty and put down riots. And one of the great things about Cadwalader is he's something of a pack rat, and his papers are part of the massive Cadwalader family collection at HSP. Just to give you an idea, this is my favorite document from the whole thing. This is hate mail that someone sent him in 1844. They draw this cartoon and they're making fun of them. And Cadwalader says, okay, that goes in the files, and he leaves it for me to read 170 years after event. So I gotta love George Cadwalader. The fellow I love even more is Cadwalader's right-hand man, Colonel Augustus Pleasanton. Cadwalader was not a professional soldier. He went to University of Pennsylvania. Pleasanton was a West Point man, so he did serve in the Army for a while and then left the Army and joined the Pennsylvania militia as an artillery commander. And he's very involved in all of these riots. And I have to love him because he left me this document, a very detailed diary of events going back to the 1830s, my favorite object in all of HSP. He is a very good observer. You want that in a source. Unlike Sidney George Fisher, who's kind of on the sidelines, Pleasanton is right in the action in 1844. He's being called out. He's in combat. And he's also a great observer of people. He says nasty things about so many people in the book. And this is wonderful to have this person kind of with this biting humor saying unpleasant things about other people. And then finally, it's a little hard to see from the slide, but his handwriting is magnificent. Once you get used to the fact that he's using those long S's that look like F's, you can read it right off the page just as if it were printed. So Pleasanton comes out very well in the book because I'm so grateful to him for this diary. The last person I will mention as a kind of major character is Morden McMichael. McMichael, I think, is more famous for his work later in the 1850s as a newspaper editor, and then in the after the Civil War, he becomes mayor of Philadelphia and is one of the founders of Fairmount Park, and you'll find a statue of him out there. But back in the 1840s, as a young man, he served a 3-year term as sheriff, which was a crazy job because at one point it was a great job to have. You could collected all these fines and fees and lined your pocket. So it was a really lucrative position. On the other hand, if there were a big fight, you had to go out there and try to round up some people to serve with you, and you might get beaten up. So McMichael is doing his best to be a friend to everyone to keep the peace. And you know, unfortunately, we have very few of his papers left. I would love to have dinner with him. He knew everyone from Edgar Allan Poe to Ulysses Grant. You know, unfortunately, we have glimpses of him, but not as much as I would have liked. Okay, so those are the communities, those are the characters. Let's talk about the violence of 1844. Now, again, this is the key places: the city in the center, Kensington to the north, Southwark to the south. And the Nativist movement had kind of been coalescing. There were ward associations, there were clubs, but not really a political party. That starts getting going in tail end of 1843. People are saying maybe we should have a county-wide party that will be neither Whig nor Democrat, something new. And it's variously called the American Republican Party or the Native American Party. And it really gets a boost when in April of 1844, another Nativist party in New York City wins the mayoralty. They get their man in, and Philadelphia Nativists are like, wow, Nativists can actually win major office. We really need to step up our game. So they have rallies all throughout the county. And the one that becomes really important is up in Kensington in the 3rd Ward, which is a predominantly Irish Catholic neighborhood. So you can imagine these nativists coming in and giving a anti-Irish, anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant talk in the middle of an Irish Catholic immigrant community. You can guess what happened next, right? Well, what happens first, there are actually 2 rallies. The first one is on May 3rd, 1844. And you can see this is, you know, a nativist view, imagining what it looked like, probably not too far off. You do have Irish workmen. You can see that their sleeves are rolled up, right? They're wearing these kind of caps. And there's this more respectable nativist with his top hat and frock coat there. And they are pulling down the stage as this man is standing on it. And that happens on May 3rd. But they're also careful. There's an old man on the stage. They kind of make sure he gets down safely before they pull down the stage. It's all within bounds of electoral politics of the 1840s. A little rough, but no one's really hurt. The nativists decide they're not going to take that. They're going to come back the following Monday. And so that brings us to Monday, May 6th, 1844. And this time, some of the most prominent nativists of Philadelphia, including Lewis Levin, show up. And they give their speeches. And again, there's heckling. The Irish come out with a load of dirt in a wagon. They kind of dump it. It's all more playful, I think, than really violent. And then this is one of those little contingencies of history. It starts to pour. Just the rain, the skies open up, the rain comes down, and the whole plan is ruined because no one wants to be out there in the rain. So the natives could have gone home. They could have gone to a tavern. Instead, they rush over to a market house nearby. And no one has planned for this. And the Irish community is really offended by this. This is their turf. It's one thing for the nativists to have a rally outside, another for the Irish to have their own turf invaded. And this turns into a brawl. Someone fires a gun. An ex-constable is trying to keep the peace, is shot in the face. And it turns into a gunfight, which is already more violent than a somewhat violent Philadelphia is used to. Now, remember, Kensington is not part of the city of Philadelphia. And that means that whatever, even if they had wanted to, the city of Philadelphia police could not have crossed the line, actually 2 lines, into the Northern Liberties and then into Kensington. They have no jurisdiction in Kensington. And Kensington does not have a police force. It's got 5 constables, and they're not going to, intervene in this. So it's up to Sheriff McMichael to try to summon a posse. Again, would you volunteer to get a paper badge saying you're a sheriff's deputy and wander into a gunfight? Not a lot of people are going to do that. And so basically, there's nothing stopping this. The violence goes on. Several people or 2 men are shot dead. 2 others are mortally wounded. And this is pretty bad. That said, it could have ended that day on May 6th. Instead, the nativists decide to have a massive rally outside of Independence Hall, what was then called the State House. And some people are saying, let's calm it down, let's think about this, let's talk. Others are, no, let's march right back to Kensington. And it's the hotheads who win that debate. And hundreds of nativists march back into Kensington for another day of fighting. And not only are both sides using guns at this point, but the nativists start burning things. They burn down the market house where they'd met the previous day. They burn down a fire station, which obviously makes it harder to put out the fires. And then they burn down the houses near the fire station that the fire spreads. This is not a terribly realistic image, but you have some idea. And one of the things that you'll notice about this is that you've got these troops that maybe that's supposed to be Cadwallader on the horse. You've got a cannon there. You've got troops neatly lined up. And what are they doing? They're kind of standing around. So they are intimidating people into stopping killing each other and helping the fire department put out the fires, but they're not actively intervening at this point. They're basically there to watch. And they are outnumbered and they're not inclined to fight. And the nativists there are cheering them and saying, hurrah for the troops. So they don't really know who their enemy is if they did want to fight. So the troops are kind of deployed. They're hoping to keep things calm. But then there's a third day of May 8th. And this time, instead of gunfire, there's just fire, where the nativists burned down St. Michael's Church, the pride of Catholic Kensington, a church that had only opened a few years before, and that Irish Catholics, that many of them had donated money or labor to this. So this was horrifying. They burned down the priest's house next door. And then that evening, another mob, or maybe some of the same people, it's very hard to know, attack another church, St. Augustine's in Philadelphia city itself. And this time, the Philadelphia police do have jurisdiction, but again, they're gravely outnumbered. The militia show up, the cavalry charges, but they can't control a mob of thousands. Someone sneaks in and sets the church on fire. And this is, just appalling to the people of Philadelphia. I should say here that the vast majority of Protestant Philadelphians are absolutely appalled by this. There's a minority of fierce anti-Catholics in the city, but I don't think it's more than a small minority. But it only takes a few people with matches to start a fire like this. And so the militia fans out. They try to protect the other churches. St. John's is serving as the cathedral at that point. But a lot of people worry that the mob is going to take over the city entirely. Instead, more militia come in. The governor sends troops from other counties, and they're able, after 3 days of fighting, to impose some kind of order. The ruins of the burned out churches become something of a tourist attraction. You have at least 9 people have died, maybe more. There's some bodies in the ashes. It's always kind of hard to count. And the news spreads around the world. 9 people dead is not a huge number, but the idea that Philadelphians are shooting their neighbors and burning churches, that means something different than just a steamboat explosion that would have killed that many people, right? This is understood to be a real challenge to American democracy if Americans are going to be shooting each other down in the street. And part of the debate is the fact the militia has deployed but has not shot anyone. And some people are saying, hey, maybe we need not less violence but more violence, that we need troops who are willing to fire into the crowd the way that would have happened during one of the uprisings in Paris. Instead, there's a lot of negotiation, and Sheriff McMichael is trying to calm things down. Things are okay for June, but the nativists decide to plan what may have been the largest parade in Philadelphia history up to that point. The prior one, the really big one, was the 1832 parade marking the centennial of George Washington's birth. The July 4th, 1844 parade was probably bigger. And we have some of the, unfortunately, we don't have any of the banners. So they did these beautiful painted silk banners, and we have descriptions of them. Beautiful artistically, I'm told. The sentiment behind them was not always so kind. But we have some of the ribbons that people would have worn on their lapels. And you can see some of the slogans here: God and country, beware foreign influence. That's taken out of context from George Washington's farewell address. 21 years is written on the ballot box. The idea that you have to live in the country for 21 years, either because you were born and have become 21 years old, or you immigrate and become a citizen after 21 years. And then you can see the mixture of religious and political symbolism. So there's that Temple of Liberty. The American eagle is holding the Holy Bible in its talons. And then the center one with George Washington, there's the Holy Bible open again. So there's this mixture of kind of Protestant and American iconography, a massive parade. And it actually goes off without any violence on July 4th. A lot of people are really surprised by this. Like, wow, we thought the next riot would be there. But they kind of counted their blessings a little too soon. Going back to our map, this is Southwark, to the south of the city, south of what's now Cedar Street, or South Street, was Cedar Street then. And this is one of the centers of Philadelphia nativism. There was a large and growing Catholic community there, but also a lot of the nativists who opposed immigration came from Southwark. And right in the middle of Protestant Southwark, Kenrick has built one of his churches, a church called St. Philip Neri, and installed as priest an Irish-born priest named John Patrick Dunn. And Dunn is worried that the nativists are going to attack his church the way they'd burned St. Michael's and St. Augustine. So he, with his brother William Dunn, has armed the church. He's set up a security force and collected weapons, some of them actually from state arsenals in this kind of uncertain militia system. And that had been going on for a while. It started in May, but right after that parade, on July 5th, some of the Protestant neighbors of this church notice that Dunn is pulling in, he's got a wagon load of weapons, and they get upset. They worry that Dunn isn't actually going to defend the church, that he's going to come out in the middle of the night and attack his neighbors. Seems unlikely, but that was their stated fear. And a mob forms around the church. So there's St. Philip Neri, and everyone knows sort of what might happen next, which is a third church burning, right? We've lost St. Michael's, we've lost St. Augustine's. The city of Philadelphia really does not want another Catholic church burned. So Cadwallader mobilizes his troops again, and he marches down into Southwark and disperses the mob. And he's just about ready to fire his weapons when a former congressman, Charles Naylor, rushes in front of the guns and says, "Don't fire." Saves a lot of lives, but Cadwallader is furious at this, and he orders that Naylor and others be imprisoned in the basement of this Catholic church. And then he garrisons the church with a number of troops. And then he makes a really interesting decision, perhaps wise, perhaps not, to protect the Catholic Church. One of the companies, not the only company, but one of the companies that he deploys is the Montgomery Hibernia Greens. And as you might guess from the green uniform and the Hibernia name and the harp on their flag, this is an Irish company, specifically an Irish Catholic company led by Captain John Callahan, another Irish Catholic immigrant. And this, the Dunns are, I imagine, quite happy with this. They knew Callahan, but this just absolutely infuriates some of the nativist Protestants of Southwark. How can we have a Protestant man, Charles Naylor, being held captive in a Catholic church by Catholic troops? This is like all of their worst nightmares together. And so another mob forms, and Callahan is surrounded. And here again we have the siege. You can see maybe that they're battering down some of the walls. They actually seize cannon from the waterfront. By this point in the 1840s, it was a little less common to have cannon on ships, but some of the ships are going out to the Pacific where there are pirates, so they need cannon. And this mob just swarms over to the Delaware. It's just a few blocks away. They capture some cannon, drag it back to the church, and start bombarding the church. And Callahan orders his troops to fire, but not all of them will obey. There's a nativist company with him. They don't obey his orders. And finally, surrounded and with people not obeying his orders, he surrenders. And the Greens are chased out of Southwark. Some of them are captured and beaten by the mob. They fire back, but don't kill anyone. But that leaves the church in the hands of the nativists. And to their credit, some of the more respectable nativists seem to have made good faith efforts to protect it, but there are also other people who are trying to destroy it. They're tearing the tapestries, they're trying to start fires. And when Cadwallader hears about this, when he hears that his troops have been chased out of Southwark, he decides to summon the brigade once again, and they march down on the evening of Sunday, July 7th. And there's a lot of disputes about what happened next, but it culminates in this volley where the troops fire into a crowd. And again, this is something that was not too uncommon in Europe. Napoleon did it. You have cases in England, but this was a real shocking event for Americans to have the military fire into a crowd. And if you can think about Kent State in 1970, one volley lasting 13 seconds or so, but shocking a nation, this was the same kind of thing, except it didn't last 13 seconds. This started a battle that lasted all night. The gunfire takes place around sundown. The troops are now in hostile territory. It's dark. They don't think they can get back safely. Remember, the Montgomery Hibernia Greens had been attacked on their way back to Philadelphia. So Cadwallader orders his troops to set up a perimeter, 1 block long from 2nd to 3rd on Queen Street. And you can visit it today. The church is still there. They did save it. And they're going to, try to hold up for the night. And you can think about, all of these movies that you see in like Aliens or something, right? Where they're, okay, we know the attack is coming. Let's try to survive. So they go through this nighttime battle. Credit again Historical Society. This is a copy of a lithograph, one of the most famous images of the riots. And it's not so much presenting one moment, but the whole sequence of events in different elements. So in the top right corner, you have Cadwallader on his horse in front of the church, right? The troops are fairly organized. Then you have on the bottom left, you have the troops kind of firing at these gentlemen in top hats. I wouldn't really believe the top hat part, but the rest of it is plausible. They've got a kind of random assortment of muskets and pistols and knives, and then the guy in the center, he's picking up cobblestones from the streets and bricks, classic weapons of rioters. You can see the sort of smoke and chaos. You can see the militiaman sprawled in the street where he's been hit on the head with a brick. In the upper left, you can see the street light, right? This is at night, so they are fighting by street light until some of them are doused because Cadwallader doesn't want his position to be disclosed. Others are shot out. And then in the sort of top center, you can see there's actually an artillery duel going on. On the right, you've got Pleasanton, who is commanding his troop. He had been waiting years to do this. Like, oh, I get to fire a cannon at people I hate, right? He finally gets to do it. And then he is himself shot and has to be dragged off to the field hospital. And then the rioters themselves, they eventually get 3 cannon pulled off these ships or from the dockyards. And you can see that some of them seem to be wearing sailor hats, which would make sense because they would know how to use those cannon. And then in the bottom right-hand corner, you've got this family, a woman and 2 small children, right? The boy is like, ooh, cool, soldiers. But she's trying to drag him to safety. And, that's a reminder that this is a fight in the middle of a neighborhood. And there are definitely innocent civilian bystanders who are wounded or killed. Not as many as the nativists would claim. There becomes this long debate about who got shot and why. But there's no question that some people who were just witnesses were shot and wounded or perished. And the official death toll is 2 militiamen and 11 civilians killed. Again, could be more. We don't really know. Again, Cadwallader is besieged. General Patterson, who's the division commander, is sending in troops as they come in. Eventually, the cavalry arrives, right? Here comes the cavalry, and they're able to recapture 2 of the 3 cannon. And then what really ends the battle is dawn. And it's lucky for Cadwallader that July 7th is one of the longest days of the year, so that the night isn't as long as it could have been. He still has to get home. Morning of July 8th, they're still surrounded in hostile territory. Eventually, there's a deal that is negotiated where the local officials, again, many of them nativists, promise to protect the church if the troops will withdraw. And Cadwallader gets his men out of there. The wounded are taken in wagons to the hospital. And once again, the governor just floods as many troops as available into the city from other counties. And people are just appalled. For whatever reason, John Quincy Adams happens to pass through that day. It's his 77th birthday. And he looks around, he says in his diary, Philadelphia is in an amphibious state between mob rule and martial law. So eventually things calm down. We have funerals, right? We have arguments. For the most part, Philadelphians praise the troops. They say, yes, what you did was horrifying to have to shoot all those people, but it was necessary. Nativists try to pin the blame on Cadwallader. Again, that's where the hate mail comes from. They argue that he had been too aggressive. If he should have left Southwark alone, they had it all under control. But even they avoid attacking the rank and file of the troops. They don't want to have a long-standing beef with the militia. They try to blame it on a few officers. With Cadwallader's approval, the city council establishes a quick reaction force, and in the hope of having a quicker response to future rioting. There are criminal trials for both the May and July riots. A lot of them are inconclusive. You have some of the most famous lawyers in the city, including George Dallas, who is then running for vice president, defending some of these cases. I assume pro bono, because I don't know how these workmen would have afforded celebrity counsel like that. A lot of the charges are dropped or gain acquittal or receive fairly short sentences. So it's really hard to say that any justice was done. We're still in the fall of 1844. The nativists nominate Lewis Levin as to a seat in Congress. Again, he's a drunkard, he's a bankrupt, he's helped now lead riots. He's actually under indictment for treason to the state of Pennsylvania for having disparaged Cadwalader's troops in his newspaper. But he wins. He wins election to Congress, and many other nativists win election to both federal and state and local offices. That said, in some ways, I think it was a Pyrrhic victory because, as many people realize, after these riots, the Whigs, I should say, they nominate for their vice president Theodore Frelinghuysen of New Jersey, who has nativist sympathies, and like all the Irish in Pennsylvania and New York and Massachusetts say, we are going to vote Democrat. And it's possible that the combination of the riots, the Frelinghuysen nomination, swung the presidential election, a very close election, but they swung it to the Democrat, James Polk, rather than the Whig Henry Clay. And that, of course, has all kinds of implications for the Mexican War and the annexation of California. I mean, we can't really imagine the world we'd be living in had those votes gone different ways in Pennsylvania and New York. So, it's the butterfly effect. I can't say that these riots made California part of the United States, but can't be for sure that they didn't either. Okay, so where does this leave us? I think the story of these riots has just become more and more resonant in recent years. So 5 years ago, I was watching TV. The Democratic National Convention was in Philadelphia. Mayor Jim Kenney welcomed the delegates, and I was so astonished to hear him use his 3 minutes of national television to tell the story of the 1844 riots. In great precision, I should say. Like, everything he said was exactly accurate. And he mentioned the rally and the fear of Irish immigration, Irish Catholic immigration, and some of the rhetoric they had used. And he said, this sounds a lot like the anti-immigrant rhetoric that is being used then in 2016. Mentioned the church burning, and he tied it all to present politics. So I think that's entirely right. The parallels are very strong. However, that doesn't necessarily tell us what to do. In trying to tell this story, I've really struggled because there are no simple answers. In some ways, it would have been a lot easier, I think, to tell the story of riots where the wicked old police were oppressing some virtuous group. But here I tend to sympathize with the forces of order. These nativists who were shooting people in Kensington and burning churches and attacking churches, they were really some not very nice people. And I think the militia and McMichael's posse were really needed to restore some order. So when I see scenes like this, there are certainly ways that probably police could handle riots better. But I look at those helmets and those face shields, and I say, yes, these are people who have had bricks thrown at them, or their predecessors have had bricks thrown at them for 200 years. I'd pretty much want a face shield and a helmet and a shield myself. And those clubs that they are using, the reason they have those clubs is to not have to resort to firearms as the militia did in 1844. So I certainly don't want to defend every action taken by riot police in 2020, but I do think that seeing some of the alternatives of what things were like before we had professional police and before we have this riot control equipment can remind us that the alternatives aren't so great either. I also wish that the story had, a somewhat happier ending politically. It was really kind of disappointing to get to the elections of 1844. Not only does Levin win, but he wins with the support of people like Sidney George Fisher and other sort of respectable Whigs of the city, who I had sort of hoped would have rejected the violence and hatred that the nativists represent. So that's not a very satisfying ending. Nor can I say that it was the worst ending. I mean, the Irish did maintain their community. They said, my goodness, we will be here. And then, then of course, the great irony, as I mentioned, 1844 is kind of the last good potato harvest. By 1845, things are getting bad on Ireland. 1846, 1847 gets worse, and more Irish Catholics show up on the Pennsylvania wharves than anyone in 1844 had dreamed of. And really, the idea that they're going to be kept out becomes ridiculous. That said, the nativist movement does resurge in the 1850s as the Know Nothings and becomes a significant portion of what becomes the Republican Party in Pennsylvania. And the first mayor of the consolidated Philadelphia wins. He's not a nativist exactly, but he wins with nativist support. So the movement, keeps going into the 1850s and beyond, and debates about the place of Catholicism, last well into the 20th century with, say, John F. Kennedy's election. The results are longstanding. They're ambiguous. Sidney George Fisher, again, the great diarist, says that riots are like a volcano. The lava is always there underground. We call it magma. It's only when it erupts that we notice it. And, I have that feeling today, that there's a lot of magma flowing underground, always beneath our feet. And it really does raise important questions about American democracy. This is a photo, taken in March of the sort of institutional descendants of Cadwallader and Pleasanton. These are Pennsylvania National Guard troops in Washington guarding the United States Capitol. And I think that's a reminder that we're not that far from the 1840s. We have a lot of basic questions about American democracy. How can immigrants prove themselves loyal Americans? How can people of different ethnicities and religious faiths live together? When does a mob represent the will of the people? Can cities trust public safety to part-time volunteer soldiers? Should these soldiers obey their commands, the orders of their commanders, or should they think for themselves? One of the reasons you have a militia rather than a standing army is the idea that militiamen will be more independently minded. How do we deter violence when we know that violence works, right? That riots do get effects, that they mobilize political parties, that they get aid and attention from governments. All of these questions, again, point to the questions raised by Tocqueville in Democracy in America, which is how in a majority democracy do you protect the rights of minorities? And again, I don't think the riots of 1844 resolved any of these questions, but I think they did demonstrate some limits of Americans' willingness to tolerate angry, xenophobic, bigoted, majoritarian mobs. That moment when the troops fire in Southwick, the moment when they say, okay, we've had enough, we will not tolerate this behavior anymore, I think they were fighting to defend not just themselves, not just the Church of St. Philip Neri, but also really the freedom of a religious minority to live and worship as they chose. And most, not all, but most Philadelphians did understand that and praise their actions. So yes, Levin wins. Yes, other people win election, but never again did the nativist mob try to rule by mere force. So it did not end their hatred, but it did contain it. Kennedy did his best to tell this story. I'm doing my best here. I think this is not a terribly well-known story. It's not something I knew about when I started this project some years back. So I think this is a story that is worth telling. I think that as Americans face the challenges that we face today, they can learn from this city that descended into open warfare, but somehow found its way out again. So sorry for the ambiguity. I wish I could have somewhat clearer lessons, but I do think the story remains important. I'm grateful for all of you for your attention tonight, and I look forward to your questions. Thanks.
Great, thanks. Thank you, Zach. That was really a wonderful presentation, and I learned a lot of I knew a little bit about the subject, but I learned a lot, and it was really interesting. And we do have a number of questions, and actually one of them from Susan is along those lines. She says, I'm wondering what got you interested enough to spend several years of your life researching these events. Seems a long way from the DC Metro.
Oh, that's a great, yeah. So it started out, there's a weird link, which is, one of the events that happens really during the planning of the DC Metro is the riots of 1968 in Washington. And the Metro, if you've ever taken the Green Line, it makes this kind of weird kink where it's going north on 7th and it goes west on 14th. And that route follows the riots because those 7th Street and 14th Street and U Street were all burned out in 68. And so the idea of making Metro follow the riot corridors was to bring economic activity back into those burnt out areas. So I actually thought, oh, that's another thing that's happening in cities, not just Washington, obviously, in cities all around the country. I want to write a book about the riots of the 1960s. And I'll have a little preliminary chapter about, the 19th century. Well, you start pulling on threads, right? And so one of
Mm,
the questions about the 1960s is, oh, they're bringing out the National Guard in DC and Newark and in Detroit. And these are people who are trained and equipped for infantry combat against other, soldiers. Like, why are they involved in civil disorder? And that turns out to be kind of problematic in Newark and other places in Kent State. And so, pulling that thread, where did that begin? Oh, it begins in the 1830s. Oh, when did people really start talking about why that might be a problem? Philadelphia, 1844. So
mm,
in many
mm,
ways, this is actually a book about the 1960s. It's just you have to understand these riots to understand the National Guard. And again, in 2020, over 30 states deployed National Guard troops in response to the protests around George Floyd's murder, right? So even today, we are still relying on these troops. Now, they are better trained and better equipped than they were in 1844, but there are still some of the same issues, right? They're being pulled away from their jobs and their homes. They want to go back, as troops did in 1844. Some of the equipment is not quite right. So some of the same issues. If you want to understand the National Guard, you absolutely have to understand 1844.
that's great, and it's always, yeah, it's always so interesting to see, how some of these things start out, and how one thread leads you to something different. But you're right. Um, oh, and Susan actually just put a comment that she was your high school history teacher,
Hi, Sue.
Susan. um, you see.
Yes, I owe everything to Sue Eikenberry. Absolutely. I mean, she had me in primary sources in high school, and here I am. Like you saw what I did like with the Pleasant and like, oh, I love primary sources. Well, started with that with Sue Eikenberry's classroom.
Very cool. Very cool. Um, our William, he was asking, kind of what you were talking about in the very beginning, a little bit. He says, was intermarriage between blacks and whites legal in 1844 Philadelphia?
That's a good question. I don't know. One of the strange things about this is that the African community basically escapes, which is, if you know the 1830s and 1840s in Philadelphia, they are much more targets of violence than
Hmm.
are Irish Catholics,
Right.
as are abolitionists. So, have you the burning of Pennsylvania Hall in 1838? Michael is out there trying to save a school for freed black children. So the people are sort of looking around the ashes of St. Michael's and St. Augustine's. Hey, that's weird. They attacked a white church this time because black churches have been attacked. So I did not research that as much as maybe I should have, but absolutely, that's a big part of the background story are racial tensions, and it
Hmm.
should show up because again, this is where the militia is showing up earlier in the 1830s, and again, some of the same debates where some of these communities are just outside of the city line, and so the relatively small Philadelphia police force cannot cross South Street, Cedar Street, to even protect that community. But yeah, some of the parallels are very, very strong. Where you probably couldn't see on the images, but in Kensington, there were Protestant families, and they would hang out American flags to try to get the rioters to say, "Oh, that's an American family, not an Irish family. Let's pass by them." And similarly, when
Mm-hmm.
there are attacks on black neighborhoods, the white families will light candles to say, "Oh, we're white people. Don't burn down our house,
Yeah.
please." So a lot of parallels between what happens to the Catholic community and the African American community.
Great. Well, then, somewhat kind of along the line, talking about Quakers. Somebody had a question about Quakers. He says, I've heard the Quakers formed a human barrier around one or more of the Catholic churches. Did you uncover any substantiation of this claim?
I didn't see that. I've seen sort of mixed things where we have again not a diary but an account written years later by a man who eventually became a Catholic priest, and his Quaker employers were sort of saying, well, finally, like, they are burning out the Catholics. So some of the Quakers, obviously they weren't uh, participating, but they seem not too sorry to see the violence, whereas others were, certainly out there donating money for relief and doing what they could. And so I don't know that there was any direct involvement in terms of physical barriers that really was, the bodies around the Catholic churches were the militia, and obviously the Quakers were not serving. The observant Quakers were not serving in the militia.
Right. Um, could you talk a little bit about how what role women play in this story?
Yeah, as narrative history, I wish there were greater, speaking parts for women. I certainly, have some sort of cameo parts. So for example, you have, Catholic religious women. There was a convent that was actually being decommissioned. The Sisters of Charity, they were in process of moving to Iowa, but they were still there. And so a sister was attacked in Kensington and knocked unconscious, and some, presumably that she wakes up like, why am I still alive? And what seems to have happened is some Irish Catholic men, intervened and shot her attackers. And there's an orphanage where there's this very poignant letter of a sister who is in charge of, I think, 99 orphans. And this is on May 8th, and St. Augustine's is burning. She can see the flames, and she's like, I can't evacuate 99 kids. Like, we're just going to sit here and pray, and we will live or die as martyrs. So we have some of the voices of Catholic women. We have some of the voices of Nativist women. There's this tradition going back some decades, and actually my colleague Rosemary Zagari has written about it. The one day a year where women were kind of allowed to speak about politics was July 4th. So for that July 4th march, first of all, women raise money to pay for men to paint those banners. And then some of them, the banners would like be presented by the women of such and such ward by a man. But sometimes we have the women of, the ward who are giving speeches, and those speeches are preserved. So we have, it's like Pirates of Penzance, right? Go ye heroes, go to glory, right? It's that kind of thing. Go ye heroes, go and die. These are very terrible speeches, and we have their voices. And one of these women actually founds a newspaper after the riots, July or August. A Southwark Nativist woman named Harriet Frasco, I think, founds a newspaper, which you can read on microfilm at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. And it's terrible. I mean, it's just reprints of other stuff. There's very little original content, so I don't quote her as much as I might. But yeah, so they're sort of on the edges. But if I were trying to cast it for a movie, I wish I'd had a more prominent woman character. So I did what I could.
Great. No, that's great. And yeah, I mean, I know we wish we would have more female voices often in the historical narrative, but thank you. Kevin asks, can you please touch on the role of Irish Catholic societies in the riots? For instance, Friendly Sons of St. Patrick.
Well, it's interesting. If I recall correctly, Friendly Sons of St. Patrick was not religious. I might be mixing it up. There were a number of joint Protestant Catholic Irish societies. And so McMichael, as you might guess from his name, he was of Irish stock, but of Protestant Irish stock. And he was, one of these transitional figures where he wins office as a Whig, but with a lot of Irish Catholic votes behind him. Right. So I don't want to, one of the things, one of the earliest scholarly accounts of the riots is Ray Billington's Protestant Crusade. And, he's certainly correct. There's a lot of anti-Catholicism in Philadelphia. In Boston, you have the burning of the convent there. In Baltimore. But there's also a fair amount of cooperation, including these non-denominational Irish societies. And, I think there really was a possibility for that to have blossomed. And again, I don't think it was inevitable that the Irish would have become the bloc democratic voters. It's really this nativist movement that pushes the Irish into the solid democratic bloc that they remain, again, sort of into the 20th century. Mm-hmm. They could have been pulled into the Whig Party or split their votes, as they did for McMichael. So it's really, was kind of awful what the nativists did to create religion as a wedge issue. Um, Another Irish movement that is going on at this time, and again, it's in the book by it, but don't have time for here. But in Ireland, you have first Catholic emancipation in 1829. That's really important to the story. I think it actually contributes to some of the religious violence in Canada and the United States as well. So even though it's not directly affecting America, nativists are worried about a sort of rising Catholic power, in part because of what's going on in the British Empire. And then Daniel O'Connell is saying, okay, the next step is home rule for Ireland. And that would have required the repeal of the Act of Union. So it becomes known as the repeal movement. And there's a huge American component to this, where there are repeal societies in New York and Philadelphia raising money to be sent abroad to promote repeal in Ireland and get home rule back. And some of the characters I mentioned, the Dunn brothers, are big repealers. So Father Dunn in Southwark, he's and his brother, who arms the church, they're repealers. Captain Callahan, who commands the Montgomery Hibernia Greens, he's in the repeal movement. Kenrick, not so much, but some of the other leading priests are very big for repeal. And so, that becomes part of Irish nationalism, or Irish American sort of identity, might be a better way to put it, is, paying attention to what's going on. So I didn't get into it too much tonight, but I did try to net the riots to what's going on in Ireland, in England, and in Canada. It's really this transatlantic wave of debates about what is the place of Catholicism in predominantly Catholicism in predominantly Protestant areas, as well as in Ireland itself, which is predominantly Catholic, but of course split between Irish Catholics and Irish Protestants. So I do try to get into that international context.
Great. Yeah. No. And actually, we there was a question on that too that asked about the nativist view and activity, or it says, was the nativist view activity seen in other cities experiencing large immigration?
Yeah. So New York is the big one, because again, that's where they win the mayoral election. There are nativist parties. There's some going on. Certainly Boston has a movement. I don't know if they ever win election there, but Levin goes up to speak there. You have in Washington, you have a nativist movement that actually attracts some Catholics for a while, because there's that big sort of Maryland Catholic presence going back to the 17th century, and they sort of attend a few meetings and say, oh, you say you're nativist, but you're really anti-Catholic. We're leaving. So and then in the 1850s, again, it becomes an even bigger movement. The Know Nothing movement wins elections. There's another riot in, I think, Louisville, Kentucky, in the 1850s that has, again, these horrifying echoes of attacks on churches. They don't burn a church; they try. The militia comes out, and at that, Kenrick has this diary. He keeps it in Latin. Thank goodness it's been translated, because my Latin is pretty limited. But he's like, oh no, not this again. Yeah, the natives movement, again, resurges, and some of the violence goes even after the Civil War. So in New York, in 1870 and 1871, there's lethal violence on July 12th, which is the big Orange Marching Day. Yeah, this persists. Again, I wish I had a happier ending, like, oh, and never again
Right.
was there anti-Catholic violence, but no, that's just not how it works.
Right. Great. Someone asked, they said, when looking at the first round of rioting in Kensington, the nativists largely ignored German Catholic institution and raised their eyebrows. In your view, does this make the riot more of an ethnic riot? If so, was the alliance between anti-immigrant forces and anti-Catholic forces a marriage of convenience?
Yeah, so this is something that's been really hard to puzzle out. So in between St. Michael's, which burns, and St. Augustine's burns, there's this other church, I think it's called St. Peter's, that was built for the Germans. And Kenrick wanted everyone to, he wanted a unified church, but he also realized that, the Germans wanted services in German. So he actually persuades the Irish to help build this German church. That German church wasn't finished in May of 1844. So I have the sneaking suspicion that, like, they might have like walked past it without knowing what it was. It didn't have a huge cross up yet.
Sure.
But it's also true that most of the rhetoric coming from Levin and the other haters is against the Irish, and Levin hates O'Connell. Like it's all mixed up. Part of it is the clergy is very dominated by the Irish, Kenrick on down, and then part of it, I think if you had a time machine and you went back and you said to someone like Levin, well, do you hate these people because they're immigrants or because they're Irish or because they're Catholic? He would have said yes, right? That, it's what we call today intersectionality, where the identities overlap. And, historians have spent a lot of time trying to pick apart, well, did they hate them because of this or they hate them because of that? And I tend to think like that's not maybe the most important question, that Irish Catholic immigrant was kind of one word to a lot of these people.
Sure.
And it's not like they were going out saying nice things about German Catholics. They did try to recruit native-born Germans. There are, because of course in Pennsylvania in the 1840s, there's still a lot of German speakers. And
Right,
so,
sure.
when they're trying to build up a statewide movement, they're going for those German speaking Protestants. So, in that sense, like they, in some sense, they really were sincere about, or some of them, and that's the other thing, a movement or a political party or mob is a coalition, right?
Right.
So
Right.
there's almost certainly in the attacks in Kensington and against St. Augustine, there are almost certainly Irish-born Protestants in those mobs. Like we don't know exactly for sure because no one's going to confess to that. But there was this one, I think, Swiss young man who was arrested, and the police are like, "What are you doing? This is an anti-immigrant mob." He's like, "Yeah, but they're Catholics. Like, I'm Protestant." Like, so it's he, who knows exactly what he was thinking, but one thing I'm pretty sure of is whatever, if you're trying to make a blanket statement that applies to everyone in those mobs, it's not going to work. These are groups of people. One of the things, Philadelphia in the 1840s, the most frequent violence is these volunteer fire companies. They get called out to a fire and they're fighting over who gets to plug their hose into the fire hydrant first. And in the middle of the Kensington riot, there's a fire riot where they attack the firehouse because it's like, oh, the police are busy. This is a great time to have a little riot inside the riot. So it's never one thing. It's a salad of violence.
It's a good explanation. That's I hadn't heard that either. Um, Somebody would like to know, do you know of any sources that give the Irish side of the story, perhaps Irish newspapers?
Yeah. So, unfortunately, there was a newspaper called the Irish Citizen. There's a famous daguerreotype taken in May 1844. It's over at the Library Company in Philadelphia, and fantastic detail. And you can see the sign. It was actually in the same building where Levin had the Sun. As far as I can tell, not a single issue of a single day of the Irish Citizen survives. So, instead what we have is we have the Catholic Herald, which, is obviously got a lot of Irish voices, but, one of the things that happens is that the Irish sources are sort of more clergy oriented than I would wish. I love the Catholic Herald, it's a great source, but I wish I had, more of the voice of someone like Hugh Clark. I showed you a picture of his house. Clark is Irish born. He comes over, makes it good as a master weaver, rises to the Democratic Party, gets the countywide nomination, and then enough Protestants won't vote for him that he doesn't go into office. The Whigs take that election. He would be a fascinating character, and we just know remarkably little about him. Same with Callahan. So, what we have is we have testimony. So, Callahan's a militia officer. He's got a handwritten account that, guess where it is? Historical site of Philadelphia. It's in the Cadwallader papers because Cadwallader is his commander. So he writes this very long letter to Cadwallader. It's also published in the Catholic Herald and various other newspapers. So it's easier to read the printed version. But I would love to know more about Callahan. So no, it is frustrating to me that we don't have more secular Irish voices. Again, Kenrick, he keeps a diary, he writes letters, but he's not in the fighting. He's a bishop, for goodness sake, and nor is he as aggressive as his sort of protege John Hughes up in New York, who Dagger John, right? He's out there. No, Kenrick is a more scholarly man who Again, I think he wouldn't have helped if he had gone out in person, but he kind of takes the valuables and gets out of the way, which is probably the appropriate thing to do, and sends out sermons calling for calm. But he's not an eyewitness to events the way that Pleasanton is, for example.
Great. Yeah, that actually leads to a few other questions. That we got a few questions asking about if you could talk a little bit more about the clergy leadership and what their reactions and messaging was to the riots.
Yeah. So again, it's a heavily Irish-born clergy. So it hadn't always, well, just a little prologue. So prior to Kenrick's arrival, there was an Irish-born bishop, but a lot of the power was actually with American-born trustees. And when Kenrick shows up, he has to assert himself because the trustees have the money and they want to have a say about how the church is run. They're looking at their Protestant neighbors saying, "Oh, those Congregationalists, they have a lot of power," and Kenrick will have none of this. And he actually closes down St. Mary's Church for communion and says, "You will obey my commands." And they're like, "Oh, okay, we will." And he kind of gets them to heel, and then they continue contributing money. And then it's interesting, after the May riots, there's a grand jury report that blames a lot of the rioting on Kenrick and his request to have Catholic children not have to use the Protestant Bible. Some of your people here may have heard of these riots called the Bible riots. That's not a term I use. It shows up maybe once in the 1840s that I found, but it's really a term that gets popularized in the 1960s. So, I'm trying to be more true to the period. And again, I've been emphasizing the electoral calendar of spring of 1844 more than the Bible debate, but there's no question the Bible debate is part of that, and I've got a chapter on that. And the grand jury wants to blame Kenrick. And Kenrick is worried that if he speaks in his own defense, or even has other Irish immigrants speak in his defense, it won't be credible. So who does he turn to? He turns to the same trustees, these American-born Catholics, some of them of English descent, some of them had converted to Catholicism, and they're the ones who actually write the response that is published in the newspapers, saying, we obey the Pope on matters spiritual, but on matters temporal, we are independent thinkers and good citizens of the Republic. Because that was always the slur on Catholics, that the Pope is an elected monarch, and anyone who is obedient to an elected monarch cannot be a true American citizen. And so it's up to the native-born lay Catholics to make that case. And whether they persuade anyone, I don't know, but it's interesting to see Kenrick kind of turn to his old not antagonists, but these somewhat obstreperous trustees and say, "Hey, could you go out there?" And some of the Irish-born priests are actually miffed by this. They're saying, "Look, we're naturalized citizens are every bit as good. You're actually undercutting our argument by having these native-born citizens make this argument." But I think Kenrick had his reasons. There's Father Donahue up in Kensington. There's Father Moriarty, is the pastor at St. Augustine's, and he's a little more verbally aggressive. Probably may have been good for everyone that he was out of town on May 8th, 1844, because who knows what he would have done. But he writes very strongly about this. He actually eventually goes to Ireland and meets O'Connell and to raise money for the rebuilding of his church. And I will say that both St. Michael's and St. Augustine's were rebuilt. Kenrick then says, "Look, we're here to stay. We're going to build a big cathedral." So that massive cathedral out by the Parkway, Kenrick gets that started. I think he dies before it's completed, but that's sort of his project. He's a great builder bishop. Ironically enough, the two churches that were saved, St. John's, which was defended personally by Cadwallader, and then St. Philip's, those both burned accidentally later in the 19th century. So none of the churches really survives the way it looks exactly in 1844. But it is interesting to see that Irish determination, the Irish Catholic determination, we are going to rebuild. And eventually they are awarded damages from the county for failing to protect those churches. So, it didn't cover everything, but they did have some, if you've been reading about the anniversary of the Tulsa riot, that
Mhm.
Black community was denied any compensation for the damage done to their community, whereas in 1844 in Philadelphia, it took some years, but eventually the Catholic Church did get some money to rebuild those churches that were destroyed.
Right. And yeah, looks like we have time for maybe one more question or so. Um, uh, we had a couple people ask about, did you notice if specific occupations were represented in these nativist mobs? Did
That's a
the
good question. Yeah.
Mhm.
I mean, so the nativists present themselves as a workingman's party, and stonecutter, butcher. There's a grocer, and and some of them. There's a figure named Lemuel Painter who's a Southwark politician, and he's a grocer, and he's elected to Congress earlier before Levin. And it's interesting because the Whigs are making fun of him for his terrible spelling, and even by 19th century standards, it was really bad. Um, uh, but there's also the elite, so Levin. I don't think he's a college graduate. As best I can tell, he had 2 years at what is now the University of South Carolina. But even so, that's a lot of education. He's a school teacher for a while. He studies for the bar and practices law, and so a lot of the leaders of the Nativist Party. There's Peter Sken Smith, who was he's the older brother of Gerrit Smith, the famous abolitionist. There are people, sort of other lawyer types, and that becomes a matter of some tension. That you have this kind of not really working class, but more of a sort of skilled artisan and shopkeeper movement, but the lawyers are kind of getting in and taking the really good jobs. And so it is that mixture, but they have enough skills or property to look down on the Irish immigrants as again, these kind of paupers who are coming to make things worse for everyone,
Mhm.
as ditch diggers, and then part of the economic tension is over weaving, because at this point Lowell is just spinning all this cotton, but there are some things you can't do on a machine. So there's still a lot of hand loom weaving in
Okay.
Philadelphia, and a lot of the Irish are fairly skilled at that, and so the native born weavers feel that their jobs are being taken by Irish job competition. And there's this whole story about the weavers strikes that go on in 1843, and sort of set up one of the reasons that marketplace I told you that had been the center of a strike in 1843. So it had a lot of symbolic importance. So when the nativists come into the market house on May 6th, 1844, it's a lot of these Irish weavers saying, hey, this is our
Mhm, mhm.
place.
Right.
And that helps explain some of that initial violence. I think if it hadn't been for that rainstorm, none of this might have happened.
Hmm.
That's what history is like.
Right. Right.
Broken glass, a gunshot, a rainstorm, that can take this tension and make it explode.
Right. Right. Exactly. Well, again, I think we're just about out of time. I know we weren't able to get to everybody's question, but thank you again for a wonderful presentation, and and a wonderful book, and I want to thank everybody also for coming out tonight and joining us. And Is there anything else you'd like to say, Zachary, before we?
I would just say that, sorry we didn't get to all the questions. You can find me on email. If you Google Fires of Philadelphia or Zachary Schrag, you'll find me. I'm on Twitter. I'd be glad to follow up with people who would like to write to me. I'd love to hear from folks.
Great. Well, thank you very much, and I hope everyone has a good evening.
Thank you.
Bye bye.